Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wing to Sar pubcast. In today's author interview episode, we're talking with Scott Washburn, most recognized for his sci-fi series we produced, The Great Martian War.
Welcome to the Winged Hazar pubcast. From fantasy to sci-fi to history and horror, your hosts are about to take you on a journey through all things Winged Hazar publishing. Sit back and relax as we talk about writing, gaming, as well as interview some of your favorite authors. Let's wing it.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Brandon, joined today by two special guests. Mark is off somewhere doing some smoke grenade research or some such. So today I have Vince as my co-host.
That's me, Vince Rospon.
And this episode's author is no stranger to Winged Hazar publishing readers. We have Scott Washburn joining us.
Hi, this is Scott.
As is usual with our author interviews, this is going to be a two-parter. In the first episode, we'll talk with Scott and ask some general questions about his writing techniques. In the second episode, we'll dive deeper into his novels and talk about some behind-the-scenes thoughts and motivations, breaking down some of the characters and themes from each novel.
So, Scott, as Brandon mentioned, you're no stranger to Winged Hazar Publishing. And for those who are hearing your name for the first time, can you tell listeners a little bit about who you are, your background, and how you managed to get involved with us?
Okay, well, first off, I should say that I'm a rather old codger, born in 1955, right after World War II. My father was a mechanical engineer. My oldest brother is a nuclear engineer, and my middle brother has been a professional writer his whole life, or his whole adult life anyway. All of them were science fiction and fantasy fans, so I grew up in a house filled with Heinlein, Asimov, Tolkien, and a lot of other classic SF&F writers. I did not start writing at a young age. It wasn't anything that I had any real interest in, and in school, writing assignments were a chore rather than a joy. I went to Penn State University and studied architecture. Prior to my retirement a couple of years ago, I worked as an architectural designer for Temple University in Philadelphia. I used the free tuition benefit there to get a master's degree in U.S. military history. I was working on my PhD in the same subject when, just to take a break from doing research papers, I started writing some science fiction fan fiction and became so taken with that. I mean, the whole idea that I could just, make stuff up rather than having to research it and document it and footnote it and so forth, with just that really I thought was just incredibly cool. And so I got very much into writing at that point. Never did finish my PhD. From fan fiction, I started writing some original fiction, and in just a couple of years managed to write 7 full-length novels. And from that point, I went through the usual years of heartbreak and frustration trying to get them published. Then I ran into Vincent and Brandon and Winged Hazar, and here we are. The rest is history.
And a good thing for both of us, we did. I really enjoy working with you.
And you as well.
You do a lot of stories that you write about focused on combat and war. Have you had a real-life experience that helps shape or provide thoughts onto how you do this in your novels? I mean, I see this in not only your science fiction, but also your fantasy and the Martian, especially.
Well, I always had an interest in military history and war games. I mean, going back to when I was very young, 5 or 6 years old. My older brothers, who are quite a bit older than me, they had some of the original Avalon Hill board games like Tactics 2 and Gettysburg and so forth. And I saw them playing with them. And even though I couldn't even read yet, I really wanted to get involved with that. And so, when they weren't using them, I was getting the games out and pushing the pieces around, even though I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing with them. After, in a short time after that, I got into miniatures wargaming. I mean, I think I was only like 8 or 9 years old when I found a book in the local bookstore. It was called How to Play War Games in Miniature by Joseph Morchauser. And I discovered, there are actually rules that you can use to, play these games by. So I got, very much into miniatures wargaming all through my high school years and so forth. And when I got to college, there was a gaming club there. Actually, come to think of it, I actually founded the gaming club. But in any case, we had a few dozen individuals also into the gaming. And then I guess it was 1975. That would have been like my sophomore year. Dungeons and Dragons appeared on the scene, and that took, it was brand new at that point. It took the game club by storm, and we were all playing D&D. I eventually became a dungeon master myself, and that sort of gave me my first taste for creating stories. So that was a good experience there. I didn't really play much Dungeons and Dragons after I got out of college until just a couple years ago when I got back in. But I still very much into wargaming and military history, reading lots of that. In the mid 1980s, I really got involved with Civil War reenacting. I should say I've never served in the real military, but reenacting, I guess, is about as close as you can come to that without actually being in the real military. Or at least, a lot of my fellow reenactors were veterans, and they, confirmed that yeah, this is pretty close, although not really. It's a lot more fun anyway. I became fascinated with the details of the reenacting, the drill, and the tactics and so forth. Actually, I became sort of an acknowledged expert on Civil War era drill, and I became an instructor in a number of different groups, using the original drill manuals and teaching reenactors how to march and do all the stuff that they did. Over the years, I rose in rank. As a reenactor, I've commanded companies, battalions, brigades, and even division-sized formations of reenacting. Some of the reenacting involve what we call first person, where you actually take on the persona of some real person from history and act out little scenes like living history programs for the spectators to try and tell them what it was like to be alive back then. And then, of course, the reenactment battles, although obviously they're not the real thing, there's very little, although not no, chance of injury or death. But there's a lot of the aspects are very similar to the real thing: the smoke, the noise, the confusion, the chaos. And so I think that experience there helped me when I was writing battle scenes and so forth. I had at least that experience to go by, as well as, of course, written records, accounts from actual soldiers.
That's fantastic. And I think it's a testament to our readers of just how much, a wealth of knowledge that you do have. And it's interesting. I love these author interviews and talking to our different authors and just learning about their background, because we just have people with such a diverse series of skills and capabilities. So I think that should hopefully help lend some more credibility to anybody who hasn't read your books to say, this guy kind of has a great idea of what he's talking about with these things.
Well, yeah, I try to make things as realistic as possible. And again, of course, it's not the real thing. But then I remind myself that, Stephen Crane wrote, The Red Badge of Courage, considered one of the greatest novels from the Civil War, and he wasn't there.
Right.
He didn't serve in the Civil War, and yet Civil War veterans reading his book thought, oh, well, this guy clearly, he must have been there. I wonder what unit he was in. And they were very surprised to find out that no, he was a much younger man and had not been in the war at all. So,
well, I think part of that's testament to the research that you do.
Absolutely.
As a reenactor, but also, I know firsthand, how much research you do in all these books. So it's not just on the fly saying, I think we'll just make up something here. You actually do, so almost like a walkthrough of, okay, if we do this, then what, then this, and what could possibly happen type thing. It's not like chaos theory in writing.
Right.
Yeah, obviously I have read a great deal of military history and have a good feel for how battles go, and of course the wargaming helps that too. You're putting yourself in the place of a commander and seeing how forces maneuver and the things that can go wrong, the so-called friction that occurs on a real battlefield. And, I try to put that into my writing. I'm a stickler for authenticity in that regard. I can't just say, oh, well, this sounds good, so we're going to do it this way, even though it might really not make any sense at all. That I have trouble with that.
Right. Well, let's shift a little bit from that to characters. This is kind of like a chicken and the egg question. When you're creating an outline for a novel, what do you usually envision first? Is it the cast of characters that you want to tell a story about, or do you try to figure out what story you want to tell and then fit the characters in where that fits?
Well, it sort of depends on what I'm working on. If it's an original story I'm doing, not set in somebody else's IP, and I haven't written anything on that particular subject before. In other words, it's not a continuing series. Then usually it's the story that comes first. I will, conceive of a situation of, what if I write a story about, this sort of thing, and so the plot and the basic idea of the story comes first, and then I develop characters to put into that story. If it's a continuing series, like say My Great Martian War, well then the setting has already been created, the characters have already been created, and so I will usually then start with the characters to a certain extent, saying, all right, well I've taken them to this point in the previous book, but now they're here. What's going to happen to them next? I can't just come up with some new plot idea without taking into consideration, the characters that are in it. One of my, favorite authors is Lois McMaster Bujold, and I think she's just probably the best SF&F writer of our generation. But she once said that the way she develops her stories is she takes a continuing character and takes the character and say, all right, now what's the worst thing I can do to this guy? And she figures that out and then does it, writes a story about that. and it's just great stuff. I'm not quite that ruthless, but still I have to take my characters and say, all right, well, they've gotten to this point now. What's going to happen to them now?
Right. It makes sense. I mean, with a continuing story, you don't want to just keep rehashing the same plot and themes over and over because that gets boring. You want to just always vary it up so it's something different than what you've done before. And speaking of, you mentioned IP. So on the show, we talk a lot about IP or intellectual property just because we produce a lot of novels that tie in with different games. Just to reiterate for our listeners, we work with several different gaming companies to provide novels that help flesh out the background and lore for their world, to help them feel more lived in. Scott, you've produced both sorts of novels, as you just mentioned. What do you prefer writing, and why? Do you enjoy more creating characters and expanding lore in somebody else's setting, or do you enjoy more just creating your own everything? We've talked on this show before about how much work and effort goes into an original setting. So where do you fit into that mold? What do you like more?
Well, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. If I'm writing in someone else's IP, I have a lot of information given to me beforehand. I mean, here's the world, here's situations we want you to write about, and so it's easier in a lot of ways, since I don't have to invent that all myself. But if I had to choose, I'd say that writing my original stories, I'd prefer that. I think there's a certain greater amount of satisfaction in doing something original, something that I created, because when it's done, then it's mine, and I'm not talking about copyrights here. I'm talking about it's just it's my creation. I did this, and
right.
And there's a certain amount of satisfaction in that, and also, of course, I have greater freedom of what I want to do. When I'm writing in someone else's IP, they have a general idea of what they would like to see, and I have to stay inside those parameters. But if I'm writing an original story, I can do anything I want. But of course, the disadvantage of this also is if I'm writing in someone else's IP, they've essentially hired me to do that, so I don't have to worry about trying to sell this thing. Whereas if I'm doing an original story, well, I might love it, but if other people don't, it's going to be a real chore trying to sell it.
Yeah, that's one of the things we talked about on our IP episode was that, in a setting like that, you have a built-in audience. You have people who are eagerly waiting for the fluff to drop. Meanwhile, when you're creating your own IP, you kind of have to sell yourself and, find ways to push that book out there to the wider audience. What's nice, though, is like when you started writing an IP and then you write your own original novel, you sort of have your audience already established because they've read your works, and then you can kind of try to lure them into what you've done. So there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to both, like you said.
But also, Scott, I mean, you've written both science fiction and fantasy novels. I mean, you've seamlessly glided between the two of them very well. But is there one you prefer, and why? Why?
Well, I can't say that I prefer one over the other. I mean, there's an awful lot of similarity in both. I mean, in these days, I've seen that instead of actually breaking it into two categories of science fiction and fantasy, a lot of people now are just calling it speculative fiction, and it covers both. And to a certain extent, that's really true. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of technical differences between science fiction and fantasy. The obvious ones that science fiction is talking about, scientific stuff, whether it's in the future with starships and interstellar travel, or even more present day, just looking at new technologies that are coming on and what could be coming on, and so you've got to deal with science and so forth. And fantasy, you're dealing more with magic and crazy monsters and things like that.
Right.
But nevertheless, in both cases, you are inventing a setting and a situation and putting characters into it and seeing how what happens to them. So it still comes down to storytelling. I think the rest of it is just the details. And as I said, I don't really have a great preference between one and the other. In fact, it's for me, it's sort of a nice change of pace when I switch back and forth. If I've been doing a science fiction story for a while, then switching over to fantasy, it's just as I say, it's a nice change of pace.
Well, I think also sometimes, especially now, we get caught up with these labels, but I think the terms are actually quite fluid. I mean, science fiction, as it originally was, I guess, coined, was more technical based, and now it's sort of flowed into a lot of different things. And the same thing with fantasy, where it's not just all wizards and warlocks. It can also be sort of magic realism in this. And I think it's a good way to approach it, that it's not one or the other.
Yes, definitely. No, I think the speculative fiction label is probably very apropos. And these days you even get a certain merging there. There's what they're calling urban fantasy, where you've got essentially magic put into the the modern day world, and so you've got technology there, and even the Harry Potter stories. I mean, it's all about magic, but hey, it's set in the modern world. There's technology. They've got there are automobiles and trains and airplanes and so forth, and of course that can lead to its own problems. I mean, I've just always wondered why Harry didn't pack a Colt 45 at some point and just blow Voldemort away, but that's an entirely another issue. But
that's a story. That's a story for out of copyright.
Yeah, really.
So I've been lucky since you started working with us. I've edited a few of your novels, and of the books you've written for us, do you have a favorite in what you're reading? I mean, I think that Across the Great Rift is if you haven't read that yet, and shame on you, it's one of the great science fiction novels. Talking about it's a spy novel plus sci-fi, and it's a very great and interesting description of how to travel through wormholes and how to develop those. But what is your feeling on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, Across the Great Rift certainly is a favorite of mine. I mean, it's in a lot of ways it harks back to the classic golden age science fiction of the earlier writers, which is what I grew up on, and I'm very fond of that. So yeah, Across the Great Rift, that was a lot of fun to do. It had a lot of appeal to me. I might add that I've actually written about half of a sequel to that, which maybe I'll go back to someday. One of my other stories, Fires of Memory, which I think you're going to ask me a little bit more about later, was also a favorite. It's a fantasy story, but it really grabbed my imagination. But I guess if I had to pick an absolute favorite, I guess it will have to be my Great Martian War series. It's been my most popular one. I've got a nice fan base that is built up around it. It fit in so well with all my experience in military history and wargaming and even reenacting. Doing the research for it, I got to meet through the books some just fascinating historical characters like Teddy Roosevelt and others like that, and so yeah, I mean we just released the sixth book in the series, and I'm working on the next one, and it's got as I say, a considerable fan following, which is very gratifying, and yeah, so that would have to be my choice.
Well, I mean, I think the good thing about the Great Martian War is it ticks a lot of boxes. It's a classic. It builds on a classic story, but then it helps grow it, and it does involve a lot of those elements in there. And as I've said previously, you do a lot of research, not necessarily in what Martians do, but the technology, the geopolitical, the personalities of the time that this is taking place, and it's sort of you're doing almost a contrafactual history of what if, but it there's a logical pace to it that's what makes it very enjoyable. It's not something out of left field.
Yeah. It was the Great Martian War is set in the time period which in the real historical timeline would have been the time right prior World War I, but of course, obviously, the Martian invasion changes all of that. But still, the geopolitical situations are still there. The historical characters are still there, and yeah, I've often thought of it as not just science fiction, but sort of, and as you say, counterfactual or alternate history with science fiction thrown in. So it. Oh yeah, I've had a great deal of fun with this.
Today's episode is sponsored by On Military Matters, your source for new, used, and out-of-print books on military history, wargaming, and modeling. Check them out at onmilitarymatters.com and make sure to sign up for the weekly e-flyer. So one of my personal favorite questions to ask authors, because it's interesting to see their viewpoints, is kind of a multi-layered one, so bear with me. I want to know, who is your favorite character in your works, and who is your least favorite? Just on who they are. And on the flip side of that, who is the most fun to write, and who was the most challenging to write? So it's kind of a 4-part question, but it's really just, who is your favorite character and who they are, like in what they do and their personality, and who is your least favorite? Like you're like, oh, this guy's a jerk, and I'm going to write him like a jerk, and I don't like him. And who did you have the most fun writing that you just wanted to write more about? And what was the one you're like, I'm really having a hard time nailing their perspective and point of view?
Okay, well, that's a tough question. Trying to single out any favorite or least favorite. Honestly, in all of my writing work since when I first started writing, which was, I guess, around the year 1999 or thereabouts, almost 25 years ago, my absolute favorite character is one I can't really talk about because she was an original character, and yet I created her to go in some fan fiction that I wrote. So I won't really discuss her, although some of her does appear in the my Ola Wojciech character in the most recent Great Martian War novel, The Grand Alliance. I mean, that's the one of the great things about writing. Even the things you don't publish, it's all still there in your records or in your mind, and you can borrow aspects of things you wrote before. So the old saying is, no writing is ever wasted. So even things that I can't publish because they are fan fiction, still some of the stuff is there, which I can then reuse. Of my published characters, I do love a number of the historical figures that I put into the Great Martian War books. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt was just so much fun. He doesn't appear in that much of the books, but I read a great deal about him. He just had so many amazing aspects to him. He's arguably one of perhaps the smartest president we've ever had. I mean, he could read an entire book in a day and retain it all. He had a near photographic memory, and he would read a book every day. He, in spite of all the other stuff he was doing, he would just be going, through hundreds and hundreds of books and articles, and of course, writing books and articles as well. And he just, and his personality, he was just an amazing guy. So he's certainly one of my favorites. Churchill was kind of like that too, although he's not quite as likable a character. Churchill, definitely a great man, but boy, I sure would not have wanted to work for him. He was just absolutely merciless with his servants and the people that worked for him. Nikolai Tesla, he only shows up very briefly, but I did have some fun with him. It was hard to really get a finger on his actual personality just from the stuff I was reading, but I just latched on that he was clearly an eccentric, and so I just took that and ran with it, and the few scenes that he does show up in, I had a lot of fun. My original characters, Frank Dolphin and Rebecca Harding in The Great Martian War, they definitely are favorites. And Across the Great Rift, Charles Crawford. Again, I had a lot of fun with him. Least favorite, probably Frederick Lindemann from The Great Martian War. He is an actual historical character, really existed, and in real life he really was a jerk. I mean, he had a lot of. He was clearly very misogynistic. He was into eugenics and just really was not a nice guy, but I needed him for the story, and so I made the best of him. The most challenging characters to write were definitely the Martians from The Great Martian War. Although actually, I had a fairly similar challenge when I was writing the aliens in the very first novel I ever wrote, the Terran Consensus, which Winged Hussar has also published. But writing aliens is a challenge because you want them to be alien, but you don't want them just to be human beings that look funny. But being a human being myself, it gets a little harder to create a believable alien character because I'm not an alien. So
we've confirmed at least.
Yeah, you've seen me in real life, so.
But it's also difficult because you don't want to create a trope, alien, and your point of reference is difficult when you're doing alien life because you could have an amoeba, but it doesn't say much.
Yeah. Well, and with the Martians, I made it extra difficult to just the writing of them because I made them genderless. They just reproduce by budding, and so I can't even use pronouns like he and she when I'm doing it. I mean, every time I would write a scene, I would then have to go back and say, did I put a he or a she in here anywhere? It always had to be it or something that was a genderless way of referring to them. So yeah, I mean the Martians were definitely the most challenging to write.
Yeah, no, I've been there editing books where an author is used, and even editing that, you have to really double check, especially when it's a character that's randomly put in, like an alien like that in just novels outside of your own. If it's just a one-off character or something, I have to go back and look and be like, all right, it says oh, there's a he. I got to check and change that. So that does make it difficult, but it's rewarding. It especially when you get it right, like you did. It's great. And that said, what sort of advice would you give on writing, whether for new authors trying to break into the scene or veterans looking for tips? I mean, you've got a wealth of experience.
Well, it's not easy to give advice. I belong to a local writers group where, we got a dozen or so members, and they monthly they will submit sections of whatever they're working on, and everybody reads them and then gives them feedback on that. And it's useful, but again, it's sometimes difficult to give useful advice. And of course, every writer writes differently. I'm probably different from most because I listen to people talking about their writing and how they write and they talk about how I'm working on the first draft and I take that to mean that they're just sort of hastily blocking out their story and leaving a lot of open holes in it that they're going to go back and fix in the second draft or the third draft. And most writers seem to work that way. They'll just try to, and a lot of advice I hear is, they'll try to, say, oh, well, just get the basis of the story down. Just write it. Don't worry about, details that are missing or holes. Just get through to the end and then you can fix it or fill things out or flesh things out in the later draft. Well, okay. I mean, that seems to work for a lot of people, but that's not the way I write. I don't work in drafts. I will write and try to make each section, each chapter as complete as I can. I will, keep working in a linear fashion. Only once did when I was working, did I jump ahead to write the big conclusion just because it was so clear in my mind and it was going to be so much fun. And I never did that again because it just made doing all the stuff leading up to the conclusion that much more work because I didn't have I wasn't dangling the writers call them candy bar scenes, the scenes that are just so much fun to write. They're like a candy bar to eat. And if you write the candy bar scenes first, then you've got no rewards left to give to yourself for doing all the hard parts. So as I say, I never did that again. I always wrote in a linear fashion. And if I got to the point where I was sort of losing steam, I would go back to the very beginning and just read the story through from the start, and I would make little changes and little edits and maybe add a paragraph here where I thought I need more descriptive work. And I would do that, working my way all the way through to the end. And when I got to the end, it was done. I mean, I would go back and do a final read through to find any problems. But I do not work in drafts. And when I get to the end, it really is the end of the story. So that's a bit of a digression, but yeah, basically everybody writes a little bit differently from everybody else. So you have to do what works for you, and don't necessarily listen to what anyone else tells you. Don't listen to what I told you because it might not be something good for you. But one piece of advice that I think is good and will work for everyone is that good stories should be about people, not things, places, or events. You need those for the story, but in the end, you should be writing about people because the people who are going to be reading it are people, and so you want to create characters that the readers care about and want to see succeed, or if it's an awful character, want to see get their comeuppance, and that's really what you need. If you can create characters that the readers are going to care about, then that's you've won the battle at that point. The rest of it is actually easy or easier anyway. So that would be my one bit of advice.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things I love about having all these authors on the show that we've had so far. And I've worked with so many different authors over the years that we've had this company going, and everybody's got their own different style. Everybody's got their own different techniques. And I think it's really interesting whether you're a writer or whether you're just a reader and you enjoy our works. I think it's really interesting to get that behind the scenes look of how each writer approaches a novel and it goes through their writing process. That's something that's fascinating to me. And I still find fascinating working with a new author is getting that repertoire of how they work and then matching my editing style to kind of make sure that we're on the same page of how we work together. So I love hearing those different takes. And speaking of advice and feedback, we always say that one of the biggest things one of the recommendations that like we've talked about a lot is always like ask for like always go to get feedback. That's one of the biggest things is that you can't just sit in your own think tank. You got to get unadulterated feedback, and that's good sometimes and bad sometimes depending on your audience. You have to make sure that you're listening to the right feedback, which can be tough. But how often do you listen to feedback you get from reviews and like the fans? How much of that goes into your writing? Do you ever add anything or tweak anything in the next novel in a series to kind of appease or cater to certain audiences or feedback you've received?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, when you write something, you're hoping that people are going to like it. Now, as I mentioned, I started out writing fan fiction, and for anyone who's not familiar with the term, that basically is stories written by the fans of some other book or movie or anything really that has a fan base. People write fan fiction stories for Star Trek and Star Wars and Harry Potter. There are websites out there for fan fiction, and they have literally millions of stories posted on them. Most of them are short, but some of them are much longer, and on all kinds of subject. One fan fiction site is just fanfiction.net, and it breaks it down into categories and they've got fan fiction for the Bible. I mean, it's just amazing. And of course, it's all done by fans. It's all technically illegal because you're using somebody else's copyrighted material, which is a no-no. But no, most authors don't really care about it, although most authors, if they're wise, will say that they aren't going to read any fan fiction at all, just to safeguard themselves, because there have been times where a fan fiction writer writes a story and then the author whose IP they're working in writes something that's kind of similar, and they're not. The author isn't copying it. It's just a situation of great minds thinking alike. That happens a lot more often than you'd think. And there have been lawsuits and stuff. And of course the fan fiction writer can never win such a lawsuit. The laws are very, very clear on that. But still it's a pain in the neck to the author. And so most authors just say, well, officially I am never reading any fan fiction, so officially I am never stealing anybody's idea. And but again, I'm sort of digressing here. But writing fan fiction is how I got started. It's how a number of successful professional authors have gotten started, and it's really useful because there are people out there who love to read fan fiction, and they will give you feedback, and it's a quick way of seeing what they think about your stories, and most of them are pretty honest. And if they say, "Oh, well, this or that wasn't very good. I like this. I hated that," so that's useful. As I mentioned, I belong to a writers group, and often I will be submitting chapters of my current project, whether it's the next great Martian War novel or whatever, and so I will be getting feedback from them. It's useful to see what people think, and it's very useful if you're working in a group, because if they all think something, if they all say, well, that section didn't work for me, then it's time to pay attention. I mean, if just one of them says it didn't work for them, but the others all say they liked it, then, all right, so you got some criticism. You can use it or ignore it. we've had a few real new writers in the group who, my wife in particular, actually, pay way too much attention to the criticism. I mean, the first story she started submitting, she just, whatever anybody said about, a suggestion on this or that, she instantly latched onto it and changed the story to match that. And her first story ended up being just like a real mess because it just jumped all over the place. Every criticism she got, she jumped in a different direction. And, we've told her, you don't have to listen to what everybody says.
Right.
And so that's a good bit of advice too. I mean, some criticism is absolutely valid and you should pay attention to it, but there's other criticism that's just simply this or that person's opinion on what they happen to like. So, as far as me personally, obviously I do look at the reviews and the comments on my stories that get posted, and I do pay attention to those. How much it affects the way I write, I'm not entirely sure. Obviously I want people to like my work, but on the other hand, particularly when it's an original story I'm writing, hey, it's my story, and I'll write what I want to write.
Right.
But on the other hand, if I'm writing in somebody else's IP, then that's a whole different matter. I've got to listen to what they're saying because essentially I'm working for them on that. Fortunately, working with Mantic. For instance, you've talked about them a lot. They're great to work with, and they give me good criticism, good advice, and I certainly will listen to it.
And it also, I think that you also, a lot of the authors talk to each other in some of these universes, as well as feedback from us as far as things we like or don't like or like to see more of.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true. Back when we were doing the Beyond the Gates of Antares stories, one of the other IP holders, I was actually corresponding a great deal with Mark Barber. We were sharing portions of our stories that we were writing for the anthologies and the one novel that Mark wrote. And so, that was certainly useful. I have to confess that I haven't been in contact with some of the authors as much as I really should. I'm now also working on a sequel to my novel, Broken Alliance, for Mantic, and I really think that I will be talking with some of the other Mantic authors a lot more on that one, because there's some stuff I really need to bounce off them, I think. So yeah, that sort of feedback is certainly useful.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, and something that we talked about in our last episode with John Leiby is, finding that good feedback. And while it is great, and we do recommend always getting more feedback to make sure that you're not just blinded by your own writing, you hit the nail on the head of you can't listen to all feedback. This comes with experience, but you have to be able to find that right level of, okay, this person knows what they're talking about, or this person is smart enough, but they're off the mark on this particular novel. You have to the more feedback you get and the more you see repetition of glaring issues that you might be missing out on, then you think maybe they're onto something. But if one person says, oh, this is garbage, but everybody's like, this is great, then you have to be able to just say that's their opinion, and that's feedback I have to disassociate from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you can't, as I said, you can't let the feedback, dominate the way you write. Their opinion is no better than your opinion, and if you think what you're doing is the way to go, then go with it. Don't let everybody jerk your chain this way and that. That just isn't going to help.
Right.
Right, Scott. We know that you're not just a one-trick pony sitting in your study with your smoking jacket cranking out great literature. You also own a company called Paper Terrain that you've actually owned for quite some time. And can you tell us a little bit about that and how you started it?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned at the start, of course, I'm a war gamer. For those who aren't familiar with wargaming, there's all sorts of varieties of it. The classic board games where you've got cardboard pieces that you move around like military units and so forth, and then there's miniatures wargaming where you use what I will call toy soldiers. We don't actually like that phrase too much, but they are toys, and they look like soldiers, but miniature figurines that we push around on the table, and they're whole sets of rules that govern how it all happens. It's not like you're not. Well, I guess some people actually do this, but very few. You set the soldiers up and throw rocks at them, but no.
G.I. Joes you do that with.
Well, yeah, or the green plastic soldiers maybe. But anyway, back as part of the wargaming, you don't just have the toy soldiers. You have model buildings, model trees, model hills, model roads and rivers and bridges and so forth, to try to create a realistic looking battlefield. And back around, it was in 2005, I started a company called Paper Terrain. It produces models of buildings and various other things printed on card stock that you can cut out, fold, glue together, and have a nice looking little house for not much effort and not much money. And my products are aimed primarily at historical war gamers, but you can also use the stuff for like role playing games. It would work very well with Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that.
I've used them with D&D.
Oh, very good. And, the way it got started was, paper modeling's been around for a long time. There are companies, most of them were started out in Germany, I think, although there are other places now where they build models of almost anything you can think of made out of paper. I mean, ships, airplanes, automobiles, spaceships, and buildings, of course. And I was, looking through some of my old wargaming stuff, and I came across some of these German paper buildings that I'd gotten when I was a teenager, back in the 60s, and really nice paper buildings, but the people who made them weren't really thinking about wargaming. And so the size of the buildings didn't really match any of the common wargaming scales, and I thought, gee, it's a shame somebody doesn't make stuff like this in wargaming scales. And 2 seconds later, the light bulb went off over my head, and so I started making paper buildings, specifically in the scales that wargamers use. The fact that I was an architectural designer and had access to all sorts of sophisticated CAD software, made it a whole lot easier. And over the years, it's been surprisingly successful.
So what's some of the latest products you've come out with? And I have to say, if you've not seen it, check out the website, which if we don't have it here, we'll try to put it in notes somewhere. The
Absolutely,
product
in the description.
It's very detailed product. It looks gorgeous. But what's some of the latest things you've come out with?
Yeah, my most recent one, I did a collection of Viking buildings, which actually I created those because I was in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign where the DM asked me if I could provide any Viking buildings. So I quickly created some, and now they're a standard product. And I also did a medieval castle set, which I'm quite proud of. It's a modular sort of thing, which you can use to build a whole castle or section of the castle. And I think I'll be working next on probably some buildings from the American Civil War.
Nice.
And these, they're not like extremely difficult to put together. I mean, I've seen them. We put them together. They fit together fairly easy, and it's just glue, essentially, correct?
Yeah, I mean, most of the buildings are relatively straightforward. It's just sort of a box with a roof on top. But of course, I try to make them look as appealing as possible. So some of like the European buildings, they'll have little dormer windows on the roofs, which are a bit more work to do. And I've done a few models that were much more challenging than typical ones. Like I did the church from the town of Saint-Mary-Église, is famous during the D-Day invasions. The paratroopers landed there. I mean that is much more complicated model than some of the other ones. But the basic ones are really pretty simple to do.
Yep.
So what does paper train have any correlation with your writing? Has working in the gaming community as long as you have helped bolster your writing career at all, especially now that you have works in several different IPs?
Well, I can't really say that there's been much of directly with the products I produce to my writing, but on the other hand, my paper terrain business is what actually led me to you guys at Wing to SAR. It's sort of a fun little story, which I will tell you. Vincent knows most of the details, I think. But anyway, selling my paper terrain products, they're available online, but I also go to several historical gaming conventions each year and sell them in person there. And a few years back, one of the other vendors I met there was in the process of developing this war game called All Quiet on the Martian Front. And it was basically a continuation of the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds story. And he had some just really cool miniatures that were going to be going along with the game. And I became fascinated with them. And, I was a vendor there in the dealer's hall with him. And so, we got to talking. And he saw my products and he said, well, I'm about to do a Kickstarter. And maybe you could produce, like a little, set of American farm buildings that I could have as a bonus thing in the Kickstarter. And I said, sure. So I did that. And so my little farm set was part of the All Quiet game. And, I supported the Kickstarter and I was very interested in playing the game when it came out. But, I was still had my hopes as a writer. As I say, I started writing fan fiction back in, around the year 2000, got very into that, started writing original novels. I cranked out, like 7 original science fiction or fantasy novels in the next couple of years, in the early 2000s. And I went, through the inevitable and typical, heartbreak and frustration of trying to get this stuff published. I managed to get like one small short story published and had a few real close misses on selling some of the others, but just, no luck. I managed to find an agent. She didn't have any luck either, and she eventually dumped me. And and so, a lot of time had gone by, and I had self-published a couple of my novels, but, never really was too successful with that. But, I still, and actually I went back to writing fan fiction just because it was so much less stressful and frustrating. But I still wanted to write. And so, as I say, I became quite fascinated with this All Quiet on the Martian Front game, and the thought struck me, well, how about some fiction to go along with it? And so I went to the owner of the game at one of the conventions and said, hey, I'm a writer. What about writing some fiction stories to go along with your game? And he thought, yeah, hey, that's a good idea. I hadn't given any real thought to how it would be published. I was figuring, well, I could sort of use one of the self-publishing services to get the stories out there. But anyway, so he liked the idea, and so I was ready and willing to start writing some stories, but just in one of these amazing coincidences that do happen in the real world, apparently. Vincent also knew this guy, and at that very same convention, he went up to him and said, hey, what do you think about the idea of writing some fiction stories to go with your game? And this guy, he just pointed to me and said, go talk to him. And Vincent did. And by the end of the weekend, we had an agreement to write the first of the Great Martian War novels. As it turned out, sadly, the fellow who created the game had badly overreached himself with his Kickstarter and ultimately, went bankrupt before the first of the novels came out. So Vincent and I just, went back and, eliminated all the direct references to the game in the novels and just published it independently. But if it hadn't been for my paper terrain business, this wasn't going to happen. It was paper terrain that led me to All Quiet on the Martian Front, which led me to Winged Hussar and then the Great Martian War. So serendipity.
So, Scott, what is next on your writing agenda? What do you have in the pipeline that you want to tease?
Well, when I finished up the most recent book in the Great Martian War series, The Grand Alliance, I immediately went to work on the next book in the series, which will be titled Their Finest Hour. And I got a few chapters into that, but now since that point, Mantic Games has approached me about writing a sequel to my fantasy novel, Broken Alliance, which I had written for them a couple of years ago. And so I am working on that now. And once I finish with that, I guess I'll get back onto the next Great Martian War book, unless something else pops up in the meantime.
That sounds great. You always have something churning in the pipeline. It's always something really exciting. So we'll talk some more about your previous works in the next episode. Scott, I appreciate you coming on the show. It's always a great pleasure talking to you, whether digitally or in person.
Well, and it's been great. Thank you for inviting me.
Listeners, please make sure to check back in 2 weeks. We'll have the second part of Scott's interview live. We'll be going over the various works Scott has produced with us. So if any of those little teasers of the novels have excited you, or if you've read Scott's novels and you want to hear some of the meat and potatoes behind what went on in them, check back and we'll talk about it then. Scott, once again, where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Facebook. Just, look for Scott Washburn. And my paper terrain business has a website at www.paperterrain.com.
Excellent. Again, thank you, Scott, as well as all of our listeners for supporting us. I've been Brandon.
Vince.
And Scott.
We'll see you guys in the next episode.